listener production.
Hey, Chris Spear with you. Welcome to The Briefing. Hundreds of thousands of Australians use short-stay rentals like Airbnb and Stayz every year, but it turns out they could be costing us taxpayers millions of dollars.
I don't want to say it's a rort because no one's doing anything wrong, it's all legal, but it's a lot more generous than your average taxpayer might realise.
So who's being impacted the most and what exactly could our government do to help? That's coming up in the second half of this episode. First though, let's get into the headlines with Helen Smith. It's Tuesday, the 2nd of September.
Hey Chris, and to you listening, our prescriptions are set to get a little cheaper next year. The cost of prescriptions listed on the Pharmaceutical Benefits Scheme, or the PBS, will be cut from $31.60 to $25, and already listed medications will be lowered even further to $7.70. The cost cutting is thanks to one of Labor's election promises that passed with bipartisan support, with Health Minister Mark Butler saying the new costs are the equivalent of what they were back in 2004.
This again will save about 5 million Australian patients $200 million a year, and will just add to the measures that we have put in place that have already saved Australian patients more than $1.5 billion a year. As I said, cheaper medicines aren't just good for the hip pocket, they're good for health.
Yeah, and Independent Senator Fatima Payman is among those welcoming the changes. However, she noted that there are more than 300 medicines currently in shortage in Australia, saying that while this is a step in the right direction, it does nothing if there is no medicine for Australians to buy. Now, Helen, some of those medications in shortage include forms of menopause hormone therapy, ADHD medication, and birth control. And we did a deep dive at the start of the year on why you can't get your medication and who's to blame. We'll pop that in our show notes. And actually, while we're talking about this, a point that I saw online, which is something that we should be talking about this morning, is that, yes, it is well and good that Labor has delivered on an election promise. It is great to be getting cheaper medications. However, good luck trying to find a doctor who's going to be able to prescribe that for you for free, because we know that bulk billing is an issue that, while the government has promised to fix, we're still yet to see any meaningful progress in that space.
Yeah, and looking back at these cheaper medications, they will hopefully help our healthcare system in the long term, because the Australian Bureau of Statistics last year found that 8% of people delayed or did not get prescription medication when they needed it because of the cost. Which creates further pressure on things like our GPs and health services further down the line. Now, looking overseas briefly, another layer to the PBS is Donald Trump's threat of up to 250% tariffs on Australia's pharmaceutical imports, which are worth up to $2 billion. But the federal government has repeatedly stated that the PBS is not up for negotiation.
Leading Australian farmers and Aldi vegetable suppliers have been accused of being part of a price-fixing cartel by the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission, with millions of dollars on the line. 4 of Aldi's suppliers are being sued by the ACCC in the federal court, accusing wholesalers and 3 executives in New South Wales, Victoria and Queensland across Aldi stores of alleged price-fixing of vegetables like broccoli, cauliflower and cucumber between 2018 and 2024.
The behaviour has been called anti-competitive and illegal by the chair of the Consumer Watchdog, who says businesses acting together instead of competing can drive up prices and harm consumers and disadvantage other businesses who are doing the right thing. And we've actually since heard from one of the suppliers, Valicia Farms, who have denied the allegations. However, if found guilty, these suppliers could face fines of up to $50 million, with their executives or individuals involved potentially facing penalties of up to $2.5 million.
Overseas now, where some of the world's most powerful leaders are meeting in China amid growing global instability triggered by US tariffs and sanctions. Russian President Vladimir Putin, as well as Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi, are among the leaders of more than 20 countries being hosted by Chinese President Xi Jinping for a major economic summit that Xi says is aimed at creating a more just and equitable global order.
Photos have emerged overnight and this morning of Modi and Putin holding hands, and another of them inside the Russian president's car, where they met for 45 minutes, the two of them seeming to strengthen their ties after the US slapped India with steep tariffs of 50% for buying Russian oil and weapons, We also got a word from North Korea overnight, with leader Kim Jong-un now on board his armoured train. It is expected he'll arrive in Beijing tomorrow ahead of a military parade celebrating the end of World War II, and he's expected to meet with Xi Jinping as well as Putin in their first ever face-to-face meeting.
Yeah, and look, just a little bit of context here about that economic summit, Helen. This is called the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit. This has existed for more than 2 decades, but this year's is the largest and most significant because those in attendance represent around a quarter of the world's GDP. So we also have countries like Turkey and Iran here. There are a lot of Western European countries that were not invited. The US as well was not invited. And what a lot of foreign experts are saying that this is a clear indication that Beijing is trying to extend its influence as a major diplomatic powerhouse. And as to that Victory Day parade, that's what they're calling the military parade that Kim Jong-un is going to be there for. We do have some Australian links. We know that former Australian Labor State Premiers Bob Carr and Dan Andrews are set to appear, but not Prime Minister Anthony Albanese.
Staying overseas and to Afghanistan, where the Taliban government is calling for international help to assist with rescue and recovery efforts after a magnitude 6 earthquake struck the country's east. At least 800 people have been confirmed dead and another 2,800 injured after the quake flattened villages in an isolated and mountainous part of the country.
And that part of the country, Helen, which is close to the border with Pakistan, had flooded over the weekend, and that had caused a bunch of landslides and road closures that international aid agencies this morning are saying is making rescue efforts incredibly difficult. Casualty figures are expected to rise in the coming days, with some villages completely cut off from telecommunications and only accessible by helicopter.
And an embarrassing day to be a young driver, with new survey results finding almost 2/3 of them are scared to put petrol in their cars. And the reason, well, it's got nothing to do with the price tag and everything to do with something called refuel anxiety.
Yes, according to British online car retailer Cazoo, 62% of 18 to 24-year-olds suffer from this, admitting they struggle with the basics at the pump, from parking close enough to picking the right fuel and even figuring out how to use the nozzle without looking like an idiot. According to researchers, it all stems from a fear of making a mistake in public, a fear that they say is heightened by living perpetually online.
Now, we have actually seen reports about this, with cringe factor apparently setting back Gen Z in particular. So very interesting to see that this is actually playing out in real life. Now, one thing that I found really interesting, Chris, that you noted down is that 25% said they actually had broken down after refusing to visit the servo.
Yeah, and at least 2 in 3 have asked a partner, friend or family member to fill up for them. So now look, while I can't personally relate to this anymore, I will admit when I was first on my Ps, I hated filling up because, yeah, that fear of looking like an absolute tool. And like, because I have, I don't own my own car, I drive everyone else's car. Everyone has different cars, and to fill them up, they're on the different sides and stuff like that. Some have buttons, some don't have buttons. So you do look like an idiot when you're that person like reversing and going and moving to the other side. Look, I can relate, but that's something that I've grown out of.
Yeah, let's hope so, Chris. But look, I've never dealt with this, but we want to know if you guys have ever had this fuel anxiety, or maybe even just servo anxiety when you're trying to fill up your oil or lift the hood of your car. We'll pop that in our broadcast channel. But that brings our headlines to a close for today. Coming up is my deep dive on short stay rentals. Think Airbnb and Stayz, and why they are potentially costing us millions. Have a listen to that next. Short stay rentals could be costing Australian taxpayers hundreds of millions of dollars every year. And a new report by Everybody's Home has found that rentals like Airbnb and Stayz could cost Australia up to $556 million annually, all because of tax breaks for investors. In yesterday's afternoon episode, economist Matt Grudnoff pointed to these tax breaks rather than migration as the real cause of our housing crisis. And today, we're going to dig even deeper and find out about the role of short-stay rental investments. In Australia, there are almost 170,000 homes estimated to be short-stay rentals, and they're often blamed for driving up rents and making it harder to buy a house, prompting many governments to introduce strict regulations to limit them, with New South Wales and WA among those. So, could we see more changes coming to the way Airbnb and Stayz operate here in Australia? And what impact would that have on our housing affordability? Maiy Azize is the national spokesperson for Everybody's Home. Maiy, how are short stay rentals like Airbnbs and Stayz costing Australian taxpayers potentially millions?
Well, for a long time, we've known that tax breaks for property investors have been a huge problem. They push up the cost of housing because it's basically the government lining the pockets of investors to go out and compete with first home buyers. So we've been calling on them to do something about that bigger issue for a long time. This report that we have out today really zeroes in on a very specific part of that, which is the tax breaks for short stay investors investing in things like Airbnb and Stayz. And what we find is that even if about 10% of those short stays that are listed on Airbnb are negatively geared, that would still cost the federal budget upwards of $110 million a year, which is, may not sound like a lot of money if you're looking at submarines or something, but when you're looking at housing and how little we spend on social and affordable housing, it is a pretty big deal. And when you go up to the higher figures, if about half of them are negatively geared, which would put them in the same sort of category as other investment properties, we'd be looking at a cost of upwards of $550 million a year. That is less than the Housing Australia Future Fund is putting into social and affordable housing each year, so it's a pretty big deal.
So how do these tax breaks for investors work?
So if you've got an investment property and you've got a mortgage on that investment property, so you're a loss-making investor, you can write off things like the interest on your mortgage repayments. You can write off local government and state government fees and taxes and things like that, which, a lot of people don't realise. But if you're a short stay landlord, you can also claim back things like furniture, things like artwork, things like cleaning costs. So it's a bit of I don't want to say it's a rort because no one's doing anything wrong. It's all legal, but it's a lot more generous than your average taxpayer might realise. They might not realise that their taxpayer dollars are actually going into, write-offs for things like artwork and cleaning for Airbnb investors, as well as the mortgage interest on these investments.
Apart from first home buyers and renters, who else is being impacted the most by this when it comes to housing affordability?
Yeah, so we touched on the first home buyers. We know that when the government puts money in the pockets of investors to go out and compete with them, it pushes up the cost of housing for everyone to buy. But we've been hearing a lot from renters, and we've got a couple of renters who are out with us today who've had to move because their landlord has put the home they were living in on somewhere like Stayz or Airbnb, which has been very disruptive to them. And if they're in a community that's kind of an Airbnb hotspot, they might be priced out of their community overall, which is quite a big deal. In certain parts of the country, we know that Airbnb doesn't have an impact everywhere, but if you're in certain parts of the country, like Byron Bay, like coastal parts of Queensland, like the south coast of New South Wales, like Tasmania, we know it has an impact in those areas. So you could be directly affected by having the rental that you're living in be relisted as an Airbnb, which is happening to some of the people that we're speaking to, or you could be indirectly affected just because it's pushing up the cost of housing so much in your area.
You mentioned there Byron Bay, and we actually have seen some state governments introduce strict regulations to limit these short stay rentals. How does that work and how does it help the situation?
So different parts of the country are looking at doing different things. Some of them have limited how many days a year a property can be listed on Airbnb, which is a good way to go about it. There are other parts of the country that are looking at things like Airbnb levies. The thing to know is that that can also be written off as a deduction, as a negative gearing deduction. So it's kind of 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. And also the ability to write off your mortgage repayments is just always going to outweigh the cost of something like an annual levy. So different councils, different state governments are looking at different ways to tackle this issue. The problem is that the tax system is really working against them. If you're trying to limit how many days something can be listed on Airbnb, if you're trying to have a vacancy levy, the federal government's tax system is sort of competing directly with you and providing a bigger incentive than you can provide a disincentive.
So what are some of the other suggestions laid out in the report that we can use to improve our housing affordability?
So we're calling for a couple of things. In the short term, we're calling on the federal government to limit these deductions to longer term rentals. So if you've got a lease agreement for 3 months or longer, or some other alternative arrangement, basically if you've got a tenant in your rental and it's a stable tenancy, then you could access these deductions, which is how they were intended. Remember that this tax system was designed well before, platforms like Airbnb and Stayz ever existed. So limiting it to that kind of arrangement would do, we think, a good job of stopping taxpayers from propping up these investments and hopefully put some of these properties back onto the long-term rental market.
When it comes to tax reform on short stay rentals, how could this lessen the cost in foregone revenue in the federal budget?
So it would, according to our estimates, raise anywhere between $110 and $550 million a year. That's billions of dollars over the coming decade. And all of that is money that would be very well spent and very well appreciated if it's going into social and affordable housing. And that basically just means rentals that people can actually afford to live in.
Some experts have pointed out that these short stay rentals do contribute to local economies and tourism as well. Are these benefits enough to outweigh the negatives?
Well, I think it's important to say that we're not saying shut down these platforms. We're not saying shut down Stayz. We're not saying shut down Airbnb. What we're saying is that taxpayers should be propping up these investments, and that it's a little bit out of balance because in some of these areas, Airbnbs actually outnumber the number of rental listings. So that's a little out of balance. If we can get some of those properties back into long-term rental, that would be fantastic. But even if we can just capture some of that money back and put it into rentals that people can actually afford, that would be fantastic. So Stayz and Airbnb will definitely continue to exist. And by the way, our estimates are actually based on 167,000 listings for entire homes that are consistently listed on those platforms. We know that a lot of people who list on Airbnb are just listing a spare room, which isn't a big deal. That's not necessarily contributing to the housing crisis. Or we know that it's a home that might be unoccupied while you're going on holiday or something like that, and you're renting it out for a few weeks. That's fine. Airbnb does absolutely no harm, and it could be doing good in those kinds of situations. What we're saying is if you're just basically operating a short stay investment, we shouldn't be propping that up as taxpayers.
So looking at the bigger picture, what action is needed from the government right now that could help Australia's housing crisis in 2025?
Of course, we say limit these tax deductions as a first step to long-term rentals. But in the longer term, we say phase out these tax breaks altogether because this is just a microcosm of the unfair way that they work. We know that when you put money in the pockets of investors to go out and compete with first home buyers, it pushes up the cost of housing. And we also know that having so many small-time loss-making landlords in the market has been pushing up rents as well. So since these tax breaks have had a higher uptake over the past 25 years, rents have been going up in the order of 5 to 10% a year. So we do need to do something in the longer term to look at these tax breaks.
Maiy, thank you so much for joining us on The Briefing.
Thanks for your time.
That was Maiy Azize from Everybody's Home. And that's it for this episode of The Briefing. Before you go, though, we'd love it if you could share this ep with someone else you think might enjoy it as well. It's a really easy way you can support everything we do here on the show. And you can check us out on Instagram @The Briefing Podcast. I'm Helen Smith. Catch you next time.